First of all, I just want to thank Bruce for all the organizing that he's done for this conference, and for his invitation to speak on this panel, which includes good friends and just extraordinary colleagues. And just to say, it's a pleasure to be seeing so many friends here in the conference as a whole. I'm going to ask your forgiveness as I read a speech, because I have a lot to say in a short period of time. And also just to say that while I do a lot of work in relationship to Europe and NATO, and in fact we're preparing for the next NATO summit in Washington in April, I also do a lot of work related to militarization in the Asia Pacific, which is increasingly the center of U.S. planning. So Bruce asked me to say a few words about the U.S. approach to China, about bases, missile defenses, and nuclear weapons. Even as the U.S. remains at war in Central Asia, and now in Yemen and Libya, Secretary of War Gates and Assistant Secretary of State Campbell repeated in recent weeks, the drive to contain China is driving U.S. military and foreign policies. 2 years ago, the American Friends Service Committee hosted a high-level delegation from the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, just months after President Obama's inauguration. In meetings with U.S. officials, we repeatedly heard that the U.S.-China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. In fact, it is widely understood on both sides of the Pacific that the relationship's essence is competitive interdependence. And when it comes to military and strategic competition, each side is preparing for the worst. For the United States, the worst means serious challenges to its hegemony on the eastern periphery of Eurasia, and thus to its global dominance. Obama recognizes that there are limits to U.S. military power, and has therefore turned away from Bush's unilateralism and back toward Washington's 20th century style of imperialism, preserving and expanding its dominant role through a hierarchy of military alliances, coalition building, and international organizations. Obama and company are committed to honoring Brzezinski's global imperatives. They are reinforcing Washington's reach and influence across Eurasia by pressing the military buildup across the Asia Pacific and deepening its alliances from Japan to India, by creating NATO's new strategic concept, which we see in its first war in Libya, and by bringing a new generation of what Brzezinski described as vassal governments, or vassal states, to power on Eurasia's southern flanks, Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. The political source of continuity in Obama's Asia-Pacific policies lies in the analysis most cogently articulated by Joseph Nye, Assistant Secretary of Defense and a lead player in conceiving and implementing Bill Clinton's Asia policies. Nye has repeatedly warned that during the 20th century, the dominant powers, the United States and Britain, failed to integrate the rising powers, Germany and Japan, into their global systems, resulting in 2 catastrophic world wars. It is of utmost importance, Nye argues, to ensure that China's integration into the U.S.-dominated global system comes through engagement and, if necessary, containment, military containment, in order to avoid a repetition of the last century's catastrophic history. More recently, Nye wrote that there are, quote, 3 major powers in the region, which is to say East Asia: the United States, Japan, and China, and that maintaining our alliance with Japan will shape the environment into which China is emerging. So when you think about Japan's military, the U.S.-Japan military alliance, it's about structuring the environment and the system into which they hope to bring China in, not as a dominant power, but as a subversive power, a subservient power. Yet as China is integrated into the international system, Nye urges that we hedge against, quote, the danger that a future and stronger China might turn aggressive. Reinforcing the commitment to containment, Obama's national security strategy explains that, quote, our alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand are the bedrock of security, read hegemony, in Asia. The strategy stresses that, quote, Japan and South Korea are increasingly important leaders in addressing regional and global issues. The strategy states that the U.S. seeks to, quote, pursue a positive, constructive, and comprehensive relationship with China. But it also warns, quote, we will monitor China's military modernization program and prepare to ensure that U.S. interests and allies are not negatively affected. Thus, earlier this month at the Shangri-La conference in Singapore, Secretary Gates reiterated, quote, the United States would sustain its military presence and diplomatic involvement in Asia. He pledged, as the New York Times reported, that the U.S. will not retreat from its commitments to allies and will, quote, counterbalance regional threats, a euphemism for China, as the two contend for dominance in the strategically vital and resource-rich East and South China Seas. And I feel badly I don't have a map with me, but the East China Sea is between Japan and China, and the South China Sea goes, as it says, south from China, and you have 6 different nations with territorial claims there, including China. He said that we will continue to play an indispensable role in the stability of the region. As former U.S. Ambassador to China, R. Stapleton Roy put it at a conference at Tufts University not long ago, this approach means that the United States can and should poke China in the eye from time to time, as we did during the recent Korea crisis, by sending in the nuclear power and nuclear capable aircraft carrier George Washington into the Yellow Sea, because we can, he said. We poke them in the eye because we can. We need to remind them that we can poke them in the eye. And I would remind people that if you take a look at the map, you'll see that the Yellow Sea is in many ways analogous to Beijing, as Chesapeake Bay is to Washington, D.C. We just think we can send a nuclear power aircraft carrier in there anytime we want. Poke them in the eye. Gates explained that the U.S. is revitalizing and dispersing its bases and military presence across the Asia-Pacific to be, quote, more resilient and politically sustainable. He stressed that the alliances with Japan and South Korea will deepen, and he promised that the Pentagon will enhance the U.S. presence in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Gates guaranteed that the Pentagon's budget will include funding for, quote, air superiority, long-range strike, nuclear deterrence, which you should understand as first strike capacities, maritime access, space and cyber war, and intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance. Full spectrum dominance. In addition to promoting Washington's new air-sea battle strategy, Gates boasted that the U.S. and Australia are deepening naval cooperation, including greater U.S. access to bases in Australia, in order to augment U.S. power in the Indian Ocean, where a U.S.-Chinese arms race is underway. India involved too. Elsewhere, the U.S. is seeking the return of bases to the Philippines, negotiating with Singapore to expand its current access agreement, and threatening the survival of the Chamorro people of Guam with a vast expansion of bases there. Years ago, 25 years ago, when I first met people from Guam, the Guam Landowners Association, they came with 2 maps. One map was where the best drinking water, fishing water, and agricultural land in Guam was, and the other was a map of the U.S. bases. It was the same map. Now it is being expanded greatly and quite literally threatens the Chamorro people's culture and survival. Of course, China, with its resolve never again to suffer the humiliations of Western and Japanese colonialism, and with its surging economy, is hardly supine. Several years ago, it signaled its ability to challenge U.S. hegemony in space by shooting down one of its own satellites. It has built up its coastal missile and other military forces to ensure Taiwan's ultimate reintegration, peacefully or otherwise. before recently publicly identifying Japan, not the United States, as its primary historic strategic concern.